The first panel will be on energy, climate and air. And while the panel is taking seats, let me just say, my name is Gregor Kiesewetter. I was a YSSP in 2009. I can only agree to what has been said before. It's a wonderful program. It's a life-changing program and a life-changing experience. Now I'm working as a research scholar in the AIR program. I'm supervising myself also this year. So that's how the careers evolve also at IIASA. And it's my pleasure to head this panel as a moderator today. I will first introduce you maybe to the keynote speaker for this panel, Yasuko Kamayama, Deputy Director of the Center for Social and Environmental Systems Research at the National Institute for Environmental Studies, or NICE, in Japan. Yasuko is working on international negotiations and institutions concerning climate change, and she's doing this using methodologies of international relations. And yeah, she got her PhD from the University of Tokyo, and she was a YSSP in 1995. And now she's a deputy director. This is very impressive, and I think we're very much looking forward to her talk entitled From Kyoto to Paris, Evolution of Climate Governance and Research. Yasuko, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gregor. Good morning, everybody. My name is Yasuko Kameyama. I come from a National Institute for Environmental Studies in Japan. And I was a YSSP back in 1995. So more than 2 decades has passed, and I'm very much enjoying that I'm back here today. And I'd like to thank so much. To be given an opportunity of giving a keynote speech at the very first session this morning, and thank you for this again. National Institute for Environmental Studies, it's a government-funded research institute in Japan, so it's mostly funded by Ministry of the Environment. And my current work is very much related to climate change negotiations, how we should be able to come up with a more effective what I have done during the YSSP period. So I'd like to briefly explain to you what I have done. Okay, as most of you here should know, there has been 3 international agreements on climate change so far. One is United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, adopted in 1992. Another one, Kyoto Protocol, adopted in 1997. And another one, Paris Agreement, adopted in 2015. And I was here in 1995, but 3 months before this YSSP program, the first conference of the party was held in Berlin in that spring. And there, what people negotiated is that UNFCCC is only a framework convention. It doesn't have any quantitative emission reduction targets. So the countries agreed to initiate a new round of international negotiation for 2 years to come up with a new agreement that includes legal binding emission reduction targets for annexed countries. So at that time when I was here, everybody was talking about, well, what kind of international agreements we should So, when I was here, these were the key questions people were talking about. First, why are some countries more willing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions than others? At that time, there were there had different positions from each country. At that time, it was really the Netherlands and Denmark and Germany which are really leading the international negotiation to be able to come up with a very ambitious emission reduction target to be included in the protocol. On the other hand, there were other countries like the United States which were really so much eager to arrive to that kind of protocol with concept emission reduction targets. So why or how does these differences come about was the question I wanted to deal with. There were some other questions like how can countries become willing to reduce emissions, or how do countries perceive cost of greenhouse gas emission reductions. Some people would say, well, emission reduction is costly. Other people would say, well, emission reduction is an opportunity to invest in new technology. How does that differences of perception come about? How can science influence decision-making of countries on climate change? Should international agreements be legally binding to exert effectiveness of the agreement? What would be the most equitable way to set emission reduction targets among Annex I countries? This was one of the most popular topic of research agenda at that moment. People were talking like whether emission per capita or emission per GDP would be the equitable measurement across countries. So these were the research questions, and I tried to deal with this first and second question during my YSSP year. What I did was I went through the literature and tried to pick up different factors that affect countries' position on climate change, and particularly on emission reduction targets, and came up with 6 factors. The first is impact of climate change. So for instance, the hypothesis would be the countries would set ambitious emission reduction target if impact of climate change is considered to be serious. The second factor was cost of greenhouse gas emission reductions. So the countries would be more willing to set an emission reduction target when the cost of greenhouse gas reduction is considered to be domestic politics. If the people of the country were more aware of climate change, then the politician will move and try to take a leadership in that country so that they will win in the election. International relations, countries might want to exert leadership in global warming issues. Effectiveness of agreements, the countries might want to lead the negotiation when countries consider target setting to be the most effective means to tackle climate change. And maybe the countries would like to follow a success story. At the time, it was a Montreal Protocol to tackle the ozone depletion substance. They thought that ozone depletion regime to be a success example to tackle global environmental problems. So some people thought that the climate change should be dealt in the same way as the ozone regime. So that's the 6 factors. So for these 6 factors, I came up with stories for each country. And went around interviewing people while I was in EASA. So there were 3 months during my stay in Austria, but then 1 week in Germany, 1 week in Netherlands, 1 week in United Kingdom, interviewing around many people and asking which of those 6 factors most fit in your country. And this is a very simple way of showing the result. And I did a similar interview survey in Japan and United States in previous years, so I was able to compare 5 countries as a total. And some of the main remarks, the leader countries were motivated by domestic politics to set greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. So that was true for Netherlands and Germany. And the follow-up countries were motivated by international relations. That was true mostly for Japan and some for the United Kingdom. And the laggard countries were influenced by the economic costs of greenhouse gas emission reduction, and that fit for the United States at that time. Now, after 20 years, so much has changed in terms of 6 factors I raised. And maybe I don't have so much time to explain each of them in detail. Impact of climate change, I think there are more, there are less scientific uncertainty on climate change now compared to 2 decades ago. A cost of greenhouse gas emissions reductions, I think that has declined so much. Renewable energy and other technology has diffused. Domestic politics, I think this is depends on which country you're talking about. Some more, some less in the last 20 years. International relations, I think there are different countries trying to exert leadership in the environmental issues. Maybe today, I think China is one of the countries that want to take leadership in the environmental issues. That was not really foreseeable 2 decades ago. Effectiveness of the agreement. Now the Paris Agreement doesn't have a legal binding target. So what are we going to do with it is a kind of new issues arising. Learning from other negotiations in the past, I think that the success of Paris Agreement in 2015 partially is influenced by the failure we've observed in 2009 in Copenhagen. And then whether or not my conclusions that I've got 20 years ago still fit today, I have not done any interview surveys, so this is really just my thoughts coming out from my own head. But so maybe you can challenge on this slide. But anyway, I think partly I think the remarks still hold true today. And there are now more research questions after the Paris Agreement. I think these 3 bullet points are very, very important to be tackled by the new scientists to arrive to a more effective international agreements. The first point is how can countries become even more willing to reduce emissions? Again, the NDCs, nationally determined contributions, when you add them up, it doesn't reach enough levels to reach the long-term goal of 2 degrees Celsius. So how are we going to be able to induce countries to come up with more ambitious emission reduction targets? That's the first point. And the second point is involvement of non-state actors. How can the diffusion of low-carbon technologies be stimulated by the private sector? So involvement of private sectors or local governments. So the negotiation should involve those non-state actors. That is very much different from what we experienced at the time of Kyoto Protocol. The third point is what is low-carbon development? How does it fit within the SDGs? What I want to say here is that climate change problem is not independent from other related problems like energy and water and so on. So we should find a nexus and try to collaborate with other research projects to come up with more comprehensive solutions to tackle climate change as well. So this is it. And this is a picture I've taken 2 decades ago. I just wanted to explain a little bit about the picture at the right-hand top. And at that time, we didn't have any smartphones. So we had to rely on paperback guidebooks. And it was funny that each of us had a guidebook of different language. But we were always looking at the same map. So this really shows the time we've had and so much international oriented group we were at the YSSP. So thank you so much.
So many thanks, Jasko, for a very interesting and inspiring talk. We will have now 2 respondents to this talk, and the first respondent is, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Jean Andorra. who is a technical writer and editor, and she worked at the energy program. What was it called then? Yes, she joined the energy program at IIASA in 1978 to work on the report Energy in a Finite World, a global systems analysis, which is IIASA's pioneering work in the direction of energy research. And she's been working as a technical writer for many issues, I understand, in between now, and we are very much looking forward to her comments, to her response to this talk.
Thank you. I'm very glad to have this opportunity to go back in time and look at EASA's 7-year analysis, Energy in a Finite World, and to reflect on what we can learn from this study. That's the most important thing. It's not just to recount what they did or what they published. It's really a study. What can we learn? And I'll talk about that in a minute. But let me start by just giving a brief overview of the Energy Systems Program and its leadership, because the leadership was key to the success of this project. The program began with the work under the strong and visionary leadership, and I stress strong and visionary leadership, of Professor Wolf Haefele. When he joined IIASA in 1973 as deputy director and program leader, Professor Haefele had more than 30 years of experience in analyzing nearly all aspects of energy systems. From 1969 to 72, he directed the joint German, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg fast breeder reactor project. Professor Haefele believed, until the day he died a few years ago, he believed in the future of the fast breeder program. Let me go look at IIASA's study, and I call it unique. And I don't like the use of this word, because in today's world, everything is unique. But this study was really unique. Most of you here today did not experience the research world of the 1970s, a world without Google, without smartphones, without Facebook, without Twitter, and without a vast and mobile internet. It was a somewhat myopic world that believed problems could best be solved if you tackle it at the national or regional level. But the IIASA study was unique for several reasons. First, the study was an unprecedented collaborative research effort involving scientists and non-governmental organizations from East and West, North and South. They carried this study out in the atmosphere of détente, when the scientific communities of the USA and Russia, then the USSR, ignored the Cold War rhetoric of their governments and opted for working together. As Roger had pointed out, the research team was truly international and multidisciplinary. Some 140 scientists from 20 countries. The team was made up of economists, engineers, statisticians, environmental specialists, physicists, sociologists, among others. The study was also long-term, with a 50-year horizon of 1980 to 2030, and even beyond in a few cases. Fourth, the IIASA system the energy group applied systems analysis. While this is commonplace in today's world, most researchers in the 1970s were only beginning to understand the benefits of using systems analysis for solving complex problems. Using the tool of systems analysis, The energy group derived findings from their mathematical models of supply and demand in order to develop high and low scenarios for balancing energy demand and supply. In parallel, the group assessed the major constraints. We called them the things that could hold us back from achieving the balance of energy demand and supply. Key constraints considered included the unprecedented population growth. Dr. Kiefertz projected a doubling of the world's population to 8 billion in 2030. Time was another constraint. The time needed for a new energy research to penetrate, a new energy project to, research to penetrate the market. That was the work of Dr. Marchetti and Dr. Nakajinovich on market penetration. Climate system impacts, notably CO2, of energy systems was another constraint, and that was the work of Dr. Jill Yeager and others, climate experts. And then environmental and health risk of energy studies, the work of Dr. Niehaus and Dr. Beyer, Lynn Rose Beyer, among others. All of these factors, population growth, market penetration, climate system impacts, and risk management, have remained major research topics of IIASA since that time. And last but not least, another unique feature is the IIASA spirit, Geist. For those of you who have had the great opportunity to work here, I don't need to say any more about the IIASA spirit. Undoubtedly, you have experienced an academic freedom and collaboration that existed in the 1970s, and this has continued to today. What was the study's goal, and were they met? When Professor Haefler and his group began their work in the 1970s, they sought to define realistic strategies for the global system to make the transition from a world reliant on oil and gas to one supplied by sustainable energy systems. What they found is that 50 years is too short a time for the transition to sustainable systems. Two transitions would be needed. The first, from relatively cheap and clean conventional sources of oil and gas to more expensive and dirtier unconventional resources, fossil resources. The transition would continue through 2030. As a side note, the environmental impacts we are witnessing today from shale oil fracking demonstrate what we can expect from using these dirty fuels. The second transition would be essentially infinite supplies of solar, nuclear, and renewable sources. But this transition would not be completed until the end of the 21st century, this century. It is not possible in this limited time to detail how the work was done and how the findings were reached. For those of you who have a great deal of patience and a passion for detail, I suggest you read the 850 plus pages of Energy in a Finite World, a Global Systems Analysis. For those of you seeking a shorter, condensed version of the analysis, check out the companion volume, Energy in a Finite World, Paths to a Sustainable Future, which I had the good fortune to write together with Alan MacDonald and Dr. Nakajinovich, Naki. And for those of you seeking a concise report, read Alan MacDonald's executive summary. I'd like to close by highlighting what I believe is the greatest lesson learned from the global analysis. Namely, it's optimism. Despite the resultant strains on the world's physical resources, on its institutions, and on human ingenuity, in the words of Professor Havler, it could be done. The physical resources and the human potential exist to provide the energy for a 2030 world that is more prosperous than the world we have today, while supporting a population double that of 1975. Moreover, if resources are developed and used judiciously and strategically, the world of 2030 could be at the transition of a critical and ultimately necessary transition from a global energy system based on exhaustible fossil fuels to a system that relies solely on sustainable resources. Just think about this. We have only 15 years or so before we reach this transition, the first transition, and begin the second one. What Professor Havler and his group are telling listeners, and I stress listeners, is to be optimistic. That complex scientific problems can be solved, and that researchers and the public must trust in the validity of scientific investigations and the facts, honest news, not alternative facts, they produce. Unfortunately, in today's world, there is an insidious distrust of science. Too many people reject honest scientific facts as being fake news. They fear the future, and they are trapped into accepting negative and doomsday thinking about a world spiraling out of control. Energy in a finite world refutes this fear-generating negative thinking, urging people to believe steadfastly in mankind's inherent ability and creativity to develop a sustainable global energy system. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean. And now our second respondent is Jeff Bilicki, who was a YSSP in 2006 here, and is now an assistant professor in the Energy Sustainability Research Group in the Ohio State University, and is focusing research on understanding the opportunities, causes and consequences of energy development and technology deployment to understand how to evolve energy systems in ways that will improve environmental, economic and social conditions. Jeff, please.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. First, I'm going to apologize. I'm reading off of my laptop. Was anybody else on the flight from Frankfurt last night that turned around because the autopilot didn't work last night? And then halfway, about 3/4 of the way here, our flight turned around because the autopilot didn't work. And then somehow the pilots figured out how to get the autopilot to work. So then they turned back around. All that is to say I didn't have time to print out my planned remarks. But one of the nice things is that I think they piggyback and complement quite nicely the comments that you just heard. But I also want to step back a little bit because Joanne and Naki and others talked about the YSSP as being a family. And my academic roots can be traced back to Tom Schelling and to Howard Rafa and to Bill Clark. And Buzz Holling for that matter. So Bill Clark was one of Buzz Holling's PhD students, and Tom Schelling advised Richard Zeckhauser, and Bill Clark and Richard Zeckhauser were two of my advisors. They also advised Tony Patt, who's going to be on the next panel. And so in some ways, I guess I'm like the third generation, and I actually have one of my PhD students as a YSSPer here this year, Yaoping Wang, so I guess we've got now 4 generations of family in the YSSP, and my laptop just timed out, so I'm going to try and it's not accepting my password. Talk about systems analysis. So, optimism, yeah. At Ohio State, I'm on the faculty of the Civil, Environmental, and Geodetic Engineering department, and I have a joint appointment in the John Glenn College of Public Affairs, and I was hired to bridge engineering and policy at Ohio State to help build a program that does that. And along the way, the faculty of the Environmental Science Graduate Program said, hey, that's a good idea, why don't you be on our faculty too? So, okay, I'm affiliated with the Environmental Science Program. And then the City and Regional Planning Program in the Architecture School couldn't be left out, so I'm also on kind of a courtesy appointment there. And I think that really highlights the importance of thinking about things from a systems perspective and how it can apply to various sort of traditional disciplines. One of the characteristics of EASA and the energy program and every program is that we talk about systems, and we don't just talk about systems in isolation, we talk about systems interacting with other systems, whether it's energy, climate, air, water. They're all these nested hierarchical systems. And as Gregor mentioned, at Ohio State, I run our energy sustainability research group, and I try to organize the work within our group around 7 pillars that I refer to them. And we talk a lot about sustainability and increasing or enhancing sustainability. And from an energy perspective, what we try to organize our work around is that sustainability is enhanced by increasing the efficiency by which primary and secondary inputs are used, holding everything else constant. So the more energy, useful energy we can get out of coal or natural gas or the sun, enhances sustainability. Also, other inputs such as water, the less water intense our energy system is, we are making steps towards sustainability. The second pillar that we organize our work around is trying to reduce the negative consequences of the energy production, transportation, conversion, harvesting, use, and so on. Negative externalities such as greenhouse gas emissions, water pollution, air pollution, land use change, and so on. We also keep in mind that enhancing sustainability is increasing the availability of energy to more and more people. So you can imagine there's more light switches out there for people to be able to flick. Another aspect of that is increasing the reliability of that energy so that when you flick that light switch, there's actually electricity that will flow when you want it and when you need it. We talk a lot about costs, so increasing the affordability. Again, holding everything else constant. When you flick that switch, you have that switch, you flick that switch on, the electricity flows, and you can afford to pay for that electricity. One of the aspects that's sort of permeated some of the comments too is accessibility and reducing the inequality of that access to that affordable and reliable and available energy that has less environmental externalities and uses resources more efficiently. And finally, increasing the acceptability of usable forms of energies. And so what I'm trying to emphasize here is that sustainability and a lot of the work that is conducted here at EASA and by its alums and by its future alums, including 4th generation student Yaoping, is that sustainability is a path that lies in the linkages. It's not something that you get, it's what you are working towards. And I really think that we need to keep in mind that we can only push so far on any one of these dimensions at one time before there might be a compensating effect elsewhere in the system that seeks to sort of counter that advance. So we can make things extremely environmentally benign, but they're likely to be more costly. And for me, this is, I think, one of the things that was underlying the comments too is the role of values. And for me, I'm happy to pay more per kilowatt hour for electricity that's got less CO2 emissions associated with it. Partly that's my value system, partly that's because I can afford it. But we also have to understand that other people and other institutions have different levels to which they can afford things, and they actually have different sets of values. And the big white elephant in the room is a big white elephant that lives in a big white house in the United States that has a different set of values. And one of the things that we talk about, and I'll sort of wrap up here to try and leave some time for comment or for discussion, is that we talk a lot about doing the science to inform policy. And I think what we're seeing is the fact that you actually need to have the scientists and the engineers at the table to be able to say, there is a technological and a scientific component to that decision you're making. If you don't have the scientists and the engineers at the table to be able to say, no, wait a minute, let's look at it from this perspective, you're going to get decisions that are uninformed that many of us might not agree with, but they're informed by a limited perspective. And so it's not just about science leading to policy per se, but it's about science and engineering and technology being involved in the policy and in the decision-making from the beginning. And I think that's really the spirit of EASA, and it's one of the things that I think me and my YSSP cohort and I think took away from their summers here, and I hope that it continues to be taken away as future, and hopefully my 8th generation students will be taking that away in the year 2080 from the, what would that be, like the 87th anniversary of the YSSP. So thank you, and I'll leave some time for some discussion.
Thanks, Jeff. And I think so. Yes, we can open up for question. I'm sure there are many burning questions after this very interesting presentation and the 2 responses. So questions from the audience, please.
Thanks for the presentation and the comments. And so my question is for Makuti-sama. You mentioned the leadership, how to understand the leadership, because someone argue leadership means you commit something and you promise to achieve that. That's already commitment. Do you agree with that, or that's far more than that? Thanks.
Excuse me, who would you like to answer your question? Is it to the whole panel?
Yeah, because the first 2 speakers, both of them mentioned leadership. And also the first one you mentioned in a climate regime, in the future, maybe China could be the leadership for such a, just what does that mean? Yeah.
Thank you for the question. A very important point. When I say like international dimension of influence, I included 2 or 3 different aspects of it. One is, of course, to take the leadership literally, to show other countries that the country is doing something good for the global environment. Some other aspect is that it's not really that leadership, but you get a kind of pressure coming out from other countries that you should take the lead in this problem solving. So that's more close to follower point of view, but still that country is going to take the leadership role. So I don't know which type of leadership would fit for China, but still I think nowadays, because the United States is in a very special situation at this moment, there might be some other countries that would like to really exert its leadership to come up with new technologies, or to be able to come up with an agreement that will benefit its country to export some new technologies, or something that will really benefit the country. I hope I've answered your question.
I'll chime in as well. I subscribe to the notion that leadership exercising leadership is not an easy process, and it's about overall it's about changing the hearts and the minds of people, and you can't exercise leadership by retreating. Period.
Well, hi, Stefan Ostrom, YSSP 2006, working a bit with Gregor on air issues, and friend of Jeff. And thank you all for a very interesting presentation and discussion. But as a follow-up to this leadership, I was just, well, in 1992 in the Rio conference, the Agenda 21 work was, I was young then, I was listening to that, and about the think global, act local. There was this effort to create a grassroots movement from the most international diplomatic organization there ever has been, but they wanted the grassroots movement to grow. And at least in Sweden, where I come from, the Agenda 21 work seems to have disappeared, and the focus on grassroots movements internationally seems to have, I haven't heard much about it, at least. So when you think leadership versus grassroots movements, are you talking about the same thing, or do we need to shift again the focus back to the grassroots movement, some follow-up to the Agenda 21 work? Will that be necessary, or do we need that type of local support, local activity, and individuals carrying on this work? Thank you. And of course, the question was to all of you, so whoever feels like replying, go ahead.
I'll thank my YSSP roommate for that question. So I think, the juxtaposition of grassroots, which implies a local scale, works really well when you have an environment where you have a freedom to operate. And part of IIASA's foundings was to provide that freedom for the exchange of ideas and knowledge from scientists from various countries who didn't like each other. But I think like EASA is one example of, in that way, sort of a grassroots movement that took hold and has had a lot of benefits. In the U.S., we have I'll say the conflict between the federal national policy and the state-specific rights, and we actually have states like California that are, in large measure, saying, no, we don't agree with you, President Trump. We're going to be cutting emissions. We're going to be doing it on our own, whether you like it or not. And so in some respects, the tail is wagging the dog. We also have had responses where, and this is a different sort of local scale thing, but one of the justifications for abdicating our responsibility on the world stage by stepping back from the Paris Agreement was the comment that I represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not of Paris. And the mayor of Pittsburgh wrote an op-ed in the New York Times with the mayor of Paris and said, no, we're bound together on this one. So, go live in your world, but you know, this is real and this is true. And so I think sticking to those sort of underlying movements are afoot. Might not come through in the media because there's always something, some whack-a-mole game that's going on with something ridiculous that's being said or done. But the notion is that I think in some respects there is this countervailing tendency when the pendulum swings too far, the grassroots can take over and foment a reaction that sort of stops or mitigates some of the directions that some things are heading. I know it didn't quite exactly answer your question, but it is a product of the ability to interact and engage freely and openly without any potential fear of consequences that leads to these grassroots movements, which can create some substantial change.
Can I just follow up on a very, very short comment? Is that your question is, I think it's very much directed to a very fundamental part of international relations. That's, and I think, in 20th century, I think most of the studies that has been done, you look at Oran Young's work. He represented like 3 types of leadership, international relations, but all those studies assume that the nation states are the single most influential actors within the international relations. But that has really much changed over the last 2 decades, and now we have so many non-state actors movement, like federal and state actors and local governments. So I think your question really should be direct to this year's YSPers, how they should deal with that kind of very multi-staged governance working in this to this first century's institution. Thank you.
And if I may take the opportunity to come in here as not as a moderator, but as a research scholar, I would also say that there is this, the different scales of governance, but also to a certain extent, a lot of the climate action actually comes from individuals still, and I think each individual's decisions on, for example, household energy supply. I'm thinking and looking at my own YSSP for this summer, who is investigating how individuals' decisions on household energy conservation measures or energy efficiency measures influences the overall greenhouse gas and air pollution emissions of a given region. So that does contribute, and to a certain extent that you can see that as a sort of a grassroots, of course, for those who can afford maybe to switch their energy supplier to a green energy. More questions, please.
Jörg Walter, I'm YSSP 89, so it's 28 years ago. I was working on greenhouse gas and possibilities of abatement, costs and politics. And I'm kind of disappointed that in just 28 years climate change didn't work out well. So we are basically didn't improve very much. And I'm wondering if why is this happening? If we look at United States, quite terrible policy development, and I'm wondering if in the system analysis there are not some components are missing. So why is the perception of energy, climate working this way? Why are we talking about post-facts? And I'm thinking about there are power conglomerates in the world, especially in the United States, easily visible. So for example, the Koch brothers are known to invest millions of dollars to influence the public to accept the dirty energy politics they are doing a lot of profit from. So is the community really looking into this changing dynamics of the world, where not only the policies sector is important as official policy and the private sector, but also these power conglomerates, these multinational huge power centers which govern money, which is much more than a lot of third world countries. Some super rich persons or families who do influence policies, doing lobbyists, the connections to mass media, buying science, and we see this in the United States. It's quite terrible to look at. I mean, it's completely frustrating, at least to me. And what would be a proper way of analysis or looking at to really bring this into system analysis? Is there something happening in current research, and if yes, how could this be done? Or that would be a question I'd like to ask all of you. Thank you.
Who would like to respond?
Who would like to respond? Well, I think, yeah, so I think if we think back a couple years ago, the United States was on a good track. And part of it was we had a different administration in the office, and we had a president who valued science quite much, and we had a science advisor, John Holdren, who had done a bunch of stuff with EASA as well, who in a variety of ways increased funding for energy, health, environment issues, set the track record, negotiated our agreements into the Paris, our participation in the Paris agreements, understood that this is a multilateral, multidimensional game, and was able to think about multiple dimensions at once. The pendulum obviously has swung in a different direction recently. But I would say that there is amidst the despair, I think is the word that you used, there is a lot of hope and action going on more at the grassroots level, to the point where, like I said, California's doing its own thing. And other cities and states are doing their own thing. But again, I think that part of this gets to where your values are, and valuing different opinions and accepting facts. I don't think that we should refer to it as believing in climate change. I think we should refer to it as accepting climate change, because it's a fact. But I think that this is, when partly where values come in, and those environmental values are quite strong in the United States. Right now, they're just not as represented in one particular branch of the government. Yeah. Why are they?
But it happens that they are also badly recognized. I mean, there are obviously interests in this direction, and who is driving it, and why is it driving it, and what are the system of this, who drives it? I mean, do we look at the right components of the system?
Well, I think one of the things that we're very good at in this room is saying, here's a cost curve for a particular technology, here's how much water it requires,
I'm saying
and letting the models
power
drive what we think we should do. But we're not incorporating into those models elements of political economy and power and so on. And I think that's increasingly being incorporated. and get your point about how can it seem as though such a small number of people can exert so much power in directions that seem to be opposite to what the rest of the world is doing, and I can't explain why or how other than there's to say that there are these I'll say resistance movements for lack of a better way of phrasing it, that don't get the play as much as the latest tweet does in the media.
Wouldn't it be interesting to put some systematic research in this direction?
Yeah.
You took the words out of my mouth. I really believe a new research project for IIASA, a suggestion, is to look into the factors that are affecting people. I don't mean researchers, scientists, I mean people, and their acceptability of facts. Because facts we have, scientific facts we certainly have them in America. But I wouldn't say America's leader, I would call it America's, the man that sits in the White House. There is an inability in America among some people to accept facts, and too much effort is put into defending facts and not enough put into why are they rejecting these facts and what the causes of rejection to deal with, as opposed to more and more efforts to explain, defend the facts. So that's a new research project I recommend for IIASA, that they look into the acceptability of facts, of truth, and the rejection that people have in many places, not all, thank God, but in many places, of facts.
Thanks. More questions?
I'm Tony Patton, and I guess I'm Jeff's brother then, because we had the same advisors.
Older brother.
Older brother, yeah. And as I listen to this, I guess I'm struck, the longer I've been in science, the more I've decided that we know very, very little. And that actually 99% of the time when we think we know something, we're actually wrong. And I was struck by this with your presentation, Jean. You suggested in about 15 years we're going to be entering into a new energy transition to cleaner energies. I actually think we started entering into that 1 or 2 years ago. And I would say if the study that you were involved in got it wrong by only 15 years, it was actually doing amazingly well. And and that our ability to predict anything is extremely limited, and we're stumbling through with multiple objectives. And I was struck by the idea of leadership, and this isn't a very good question because I'm not asking a question, but maybe you have something to say. I was struck a couple days ago by an article in the New York Times about Norway. And of course, Norway, on the one hand, is exerting exactly the leadership we need in one area of the climate problem, namely electric mobility in light vehicles. And already more than a third of the cars sold in Norway are electric, and within a couple years they're going to be at a half. And within about 8 years, they're going to be at about 100%. And we need a country like Norway to show us what's possible. On the other hand, the government of Norway is the leading country at doing a very good job of finding new oil and gas reserves to sell to the rest of the world. And it's completely, it makes no sense, right? And it probably doesn't make any sense. I don't live in Norway, but it probably doesn't make any sense there. And I live in Switzerland, there's an awful lot in Switzerland that doesn't make any sense. And it's because we're all stumbling through everything for the first time. And I wonder how that sort of fits into, for example, the story of the evolution from Kyoto to Paris, where we're stumbling through a different world of climate change than we had 10 years ago. Because now we're in a world where the co-benefits of mitigation technologies exceeds the difference in cost between them and conventional fuels. We're stumbling through a world where the United States is more or less irrelevant, and in international negotiations. and how we deal with that.
I think everything should have been solved if I could answer your question. Your point is very much correct, and we're still struggling. It's not really easy to say, well, this is the way we should go, and everybody agree to it and change. It's not happening, unfortunately. But maybe you want to.
Oh, well, I try to tell my students that you don't know how to do a PhD until you've done a PhD. You stumble through all the way, and I think it's sort of reflected in your statement, Tony. I would actually say, at least in the United States, the big transition started a decade ago, when hydraulic fracturing was exempted from the Clean Drinking Water Act, which allowed that to go forward. And while people might not like hydraulic fracturing because it produces natural gas, we have coal-fired power plants that are shutting down left and right. And the ability to use natural gas to dispatch it as you want is providing great firming power for the increase in wind and solar that's going on in the United States as well. But I think, part of your comment also gets to, we can only project that which we know to project. And I don't think too many people foresaw the shale revolution in the United States, 15 years ago. I think that this sort of gets to part of the role of models is to start the discussion and to have the discussion about, where can we be and how can we be there? And I do agree with your point. If we're only off by 15 years, we're doing pretty well. But again, I think like when we exercise the ability to step back and think a little bit more thoroughly about an issue, which is part of what systems analysis is about, we can come to greater insight and maybe affect better change. And I see you're itching to get the microphone, Jean. No? Oh, I thought you went. Okay. Yeah. I think we are. Yeah. Phrase it, characterizing it is stumbling through, and while I would agree that we don't really know that much, is not necessarily the message that we want certain echelons and power to take away. But yeah, it's a good point.
I think we are struggling, but it doesn't mean that we are not making progress, because I think if you compare the time of the Bush administration when he withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol in 2001 and what we see now in the Paris Agreement, it's very different. And in 2001, when Bush announced the withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol, there was no opposition coming up from inside the United States. I think there are most of the people who still consider climate change as too scientifically uncertain and also very much costly to reduce emissions. And even in the international, the Japanese governments didn't criticize the United States. The Japanese people more or less criticized the Kyoto Protocol for not being able to be supported by the United States. But this time around, when President Trump announced his willingness to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, there were so many voices coming up from inside the United States, as well as the international community saying that, well, the United States is wrong. And I think I would say wrong.
The United States isn't wrong. He who shall not be named is wrong.
There's a dramatic difference. So it's very slow, but I think we're still making progress.
Okay, so fortunately we are back at the message of optimism that came from Jean. And with that, I think we have to close, unfortunately, this very interesting discussion.